From getting their heads chopped off, to vanishing in the Tower, to even being murdered by their own wives. This is every British monarch who lost power and why. Edward VIII, the king who chose love. Edward VIII became king in January 1936 and seemed like Britain's modern, charismatic future. Instead, he lasted 11 months and created the only voluntary abdication in British history. Edward's problem was Wallis Simpson, an American twice divorcee. As Supreme Governor of the Church of England, he couldn't marry a divorced woman. The government, church, and dominions all opposed the marriage. Edward faced a choice, the crown or the woman he loved. On December 11, 1936, he chose love and abdicated. His brother became George VI. Edward spent the rest of his life as an irrelevant ex-king in exile. At least Edward walked away voluntarily. Our next king wasn't so fortunate. Ethelred II, the Unready. Ethelred became king of England in 978 when he was 12 years old. His nickname, the Unready, meant he was poorly advised, which sums up his reign perfectly. Danish Vikings kept raiding England, and Ethelred's solution was paying them to leave. This backfired completely because the Vikings kept returning for more money. In 1002 AD, Ethelred ordered the massacre of all Danes in England. Among the victims was Gunhild, sister of Danish king Saewyn Forkbeard. Saewyn invaded, seeking revenge, and conquered England in 1013 AD. Ethelred fled to Normandy, having literally paid for his own defeat. James II, the bloodless revolutionary. James II became king of England in 1685 as the last Catholic monarch. He immediately tried converting Protestant England back to Catholicism, ignoring centuries of religious change. James packed his government with Catholics and bypassed Parliament. When his Catholic son was born in 1688, Protestant England panicked. A Catholic dynasty would rule forever. 7 nobles secretly invited Protestant William of Orange to invade. When William landed with his Dutch army, James' support collapsed overnight. His own generals, navy, and daughter abandoned him. James fled to France without fighting, and the Parliament declared he had abdicated and crowned William and Mary. James spent his remaining years plotting failed comebacks from exile. But escaping was nothing compared to total humiliation. John Balliol, Tomb Tabard. John Balliol became King of Scotland in 1292 because Edward I of England wanted a puppet king, and Balliol was perfect. Edward treated Balliol like a servant. He forced John to appear in English courts, overruled Scottish legal decisions, and made Balliol provide soldiers for England's wars. By 1296, Scottish nobles allied with France against England. When Edward I invaded Scotland, Balliol surrendered without fighting. Edward publicly stripped Balliol of his royal symbols. They tore the royal arms off his surcoat, giving him the nickname Tomb Tabard, empty coat. Scotland lost its independence completely. Edward IV, the comeback king. Edward IV seized his English throne in 1461 during the War of the Roses, defeating Henry VI. But Edward's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville enraged his most powerful ally, the Jarl of Warwick. Warwick had planned Edward's marriage to a French princess for diplomacy. When Edward elevated Elizabeth's family to dominant positions instead, Warwick felt betrayed. In 1470, Warwick rebelled and invaded England with a small army. Edward's support collapsed and he fled to Flanders while Warwick restored the mad Henry VI to the throne. Edward returned in 1471 with foreign backing, defeated Warwick at the Battle of Barnet, and reclaimed his crown. Henry VI was murdered in the Tower. Edward successfully fought his way back to power after losing it. But political betrayal was nothing compared to family treachery. James III of Scotland, the unloved king. James III became King of Scotland in 1460. But quickly alienated his nobles by surrounding himself with low-born favorites and avoiding the warfare they expected. By 1488, James's nobles rebelled against him. They used his teenage son as their leader, convincing the future James IV to join the rebellion against his own father. At the Battle of Sauchiburn, James III led his forces against the rebel army. He was defeated and killed during the fighting. His son was immediately crowned James IV on the battlefield. But at least James died as a warrior. Our next queen never had a chance. Lady Jean Grey, the 9 Days Queen. Lady Jean Grey became Queen of England in 1553 when she was 16. She never wanted the throne and fainted when told she was queen. Edward VI died without an heir, and his Protestant advisors feared his Catholic sister Mary would reverse the Reformation, so they convinced him to name Jane, his Protestant cousin, as successor. Jane was proclaimed queen on July 10, 1553. But the English people supported Mary Tudor's rightful claim. Within 9 days, Jane's support collapsed. Mary marched on London and deposed Jane on July 19th. Jane was imprisoned in the Tower. She was executed in February 1554 after her father joined a rebellion. At least Jane's death was quick compared to what came next. Edward V, the Lost Prince. Edward V became King of England in April 1483 when he was 12. His father, Edward IV, had died, leaving the boy to inherit a kingdom in a power struggle. Edward's uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed protector, but Richard declared Edward and his brother illegitimate, claiming their father's marriage was invalid. In June 1483, Richard seized the throne as Richard III. Edward V and his 10-year-old brother were moved to the Tower of London. They were never seen alive again. The princes disappeared completely. Most historians believe Richard murdered them to secure his throne. Their bodies were never found. Edward V reigned 2 months and was never crowned. Henry VI, the Mad King. Henry VI became King of England when he was 9 months old. By the time he grew up, he suffered from mental breakdowns that left him completely incapacitated. Henry's weakness triggered the War of the Roses in 1461. Edward of York defeated Henry's forces at the Battle of Towton and seized the throne. Henry fled into exile. 10 years later, the Jarl of Warwick invaded England and restored Henry to the throne in 1470. For 6 months, Henry ruled again, while Edward IV gathered support. Edward returned in 1471, crushed Henry's supporters at Barnet and Tewkesbury, and reclaimed his crown. Henry was imprisoned in the Tower and murdered in May 1471. Henry lost his throne twice to the same rival and paid with his life. At least Henry lost power to his enemies. Our next king was betrayed by his own family. Richard II, the narcissistic tyrant. Richard II became King of England at age 10 and handled the peasants' revolt bravely when he was 14. But by his 30s, Richard believed he was chosen by God and didn't need to listen to anyone. Richard arrested his nobles and seized their lands. Some he executed without trial, others he banished forever. When his cousin Henry Bolingbroke was cheated out of his inheritance, Richard made a fatal mistake. Richard went to Ireland to fight, leaving England undefended. Henry invaded and found the whole country ready to rebel against the tyrant king. Richard returned to find his kingdom gone and Henry's supporters everywhere. Henry captured Richard and locked him in Pontefract Castle where he died in 1400, probably starving to death. But losing power through arrogance was nothing compared to what came next. Harold II, the last Anglo-Saxon king. Harold II became King of England in January 1066 after Edward the Confessor died without an heir. Harold had barely been crowned when 2 invasions threatened his kingdom. First came his brother Tostig with Norwegian King Harald Hardrada. Harold marched north and crushed them at Stamford Bridge on September 25th, killing both invaders. 3 days later, William of Normandy landed on the south coast. Harold force-marched his exhausted army 250 miles south to meet this threat. At the Battle of Hastings on October 14th, Harold's tired troops faced William's fresh Norman forces. The battle raged all day until Harold was struck in the eye and killed. Harold's death ended the 600 years of Anglo-Saxon rule. William the Conqueror became king. But dying in battle was nothing compared to being slowly tortured to death. Edward II, the Disaster King. Edward II became King of England in 1307 and inherited the most powerful kingdom in Europe. His father had conquered Wales and nearly conquered Scotland. Edward destroyed it all. Edward prioritized his male lovers over ruling. First Piers Gaveston, then Hugh Despenser, after nobles murdered Gaveston in 1312. In 1314, Edward led 20,000 men against Scottish rebels at Bannockburn. Robert the Bruce had 7,000. The English were completely destroyed and Scotland was free forever. By 1326, Edward's wife Isabella invaded England with her lover Roger Mortmile and deposed Edward within months. Edward died horribly in Berkeley Castle in 1327. Allegedly murdered with a red-hot poker. But torture was nothing compared to losing an entire empire. John Lackland, the Empire Destroyer. John became King of England in 1199 and inherited the largest empire in Europe. England, Ireland, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Within 15 years, almost all was gone. John murdered his nephew Arthur of Brittany in 1203. Arthur had a better claim to the throne, so John killed the 16-year-old, probably with his own hands. French King Philip Augustus invaded Normandy in 1204 while John sat in England doing nothing. Castle after castle surrendered without fighting. Within months, the English had lost Normandy, Anjou, and most French territories. By 1215, John's nobles forced him to sign the Magna Carta, limiting royal power forever. John died during civil war the next year with French armies invading England. But losing an empire was nothing compared to our final king, Mary, the Scandalous Queen. Mary became Queen of Scotland when she was 6 days old and grew up in the French court. She returned to Scotland in 1561 as a beautiful but politically naive 19-year-old. Mary's downfall began with her marriages. Her second husband, Lord Darnley, was murdered in 1567. 3 months later, Mary married the Jarl of Bothwell, the prime suspect in Darnley's murder. Scottish lords were horrified. They raised an army against Mary and defeated her at Carberry Hill. Mary was imprisoned at Lochleven Castle and forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son. Mary escaped to England seeking protection from Elizabeth I. Instead, Elizabeth imprisoned her for 19 years. In 1587, Mary was found guilty of plotting against Elizabeth and beheaded. But even execution was merciful compared to our final king, Charles I, the martyred despot. Charles I became King of England in 1625, believing God had chosen him to rule without limits. He thought Parliament existed only to give him money, not question his decisions. Charles ruled for 11 years without calling Parliament. He raised taxes through old laws and arrested people who refused to pay. When his enemies complained, Charles ignored them. By 1642, Parliament raised an army to fight the king. Charles raised his own army. For 6 years, England tore itself apart in civil war. Over 200,000 people died. Charles lost the war in 1648. Parliament put him on trial for treason against his own people. Charles refused to recognize the court, saying kings only answered to God. On January 30th, 1649, they chopped off his head outside the banqueting house. England abolished the monarchy for 11 years. Charles became the first and only English king executed by his own subjects.